All right. And welcome back, you guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hageman. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. All the best wishes to you who are listening, you who are watching. Thank you so much for the support, the comments, the DMs. This helps more than you guys know. Rating, reviewing the show on Apple and Spotify. It gets this in front of more people. So those of you who have done that, thank you. Thank you. I really, really owe it to you. As always, bringing on some guests bi-weekly. So if there's anyone you want me to sit down and chat with, anyone you think would be a really good fit for this kind of medium, let me know. Drop them in the comments below, tag them, or just send me a message. But today we are getting into something that, frankly, is a pretty big request that I get from you guys in some form or fashion. At this point, you've already heard the last comprehensive practical episode I went into breaking down thyroid function, and a lot of y'all have requested that we go deeper into the health markers, that we, get just very in the trenches on, and not in a pedantic way, but really just to give you that baseline understanding of what could be impacting my results. How do I interpret lab work? How can I get a better sense of what's going on under the hood? Because we'll talk about something that comes up all the time. I talk about this relentlessly, and that is fat loss stalls. Now, you can be sticking to your calories, you can be moving, and the results just aren't there. And if you've been here before, I want you to know, you're not crazy. You're not doing it wrong. Unless you are doing it wrong. In that case, do it right. But there very well could be something that is going on under the hood that could be impeding the results that you're after. And, at the core of this, yes, calories in, calories out. To lose fat, you need to be in a deficit so that your body taps into that stored energy through a process called lipolysis. This is non-negotiable. And I'm not about to backtrack. I'm not going to say hey, if this is you, this could be why you can't. It's yeah, but it's still, a deficit does work, even in people who are suboptimal, even with people who have downregulated hormones. However, here's the thing. How efficiently your body burns fat can be impacted by underlying systems that are off balance. Think of it this way. Your metabolism is like a car engine, and CECO is the fuel that powers it. So you need that fuel. Bottom line, if you don't have it, you can't go. But if there are mechanical issues, if you have shitty tires, spark plugs, batteries dead, clogged filter, the car isn't going to run as well, even if the tank is full. So today we are going to look under the hood, and we are going to cover 4 key areas that I see causing the most disruption in your fat loss efficiency. So number 1, glucose management. Number 2, thyroid function. Number 3, stress response, so cortisol. And number 4, estrogen imbalances. Now, these aren't the only culprits, but when I was organizing this information and trying to figure out really the best way to go about laying this all out for comprehension, I think these are going to be the ones that probably are the most impactful, and they're certainly the ones that I see the most. So let's dive in. We are going to start with glucose management. Glucose management is how well your body handles blood sugar, and out the center of this is insulin, a hormone that controls where energy, so glucose, goes in your body. And if glucose management is off, oftentimes also referred to as nutrient partitioning, that's how I refer to it, it can make fat loss harder and promote fat storage, especially viscerally, so specifically around organs, around the waistline. So when we look at insulin and how it works, insulin is released by the pancreas when blood glucose rises after eating. Now, its job is to shuttle glucose into your cells to be used for energy. Now, when you have extra glucose, insulin helps store it as glycogen in your muscles and liver, and if those are full, as body fat. Now, when we look at insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance, this is good. Insulin sensitivity is where we want to be. When you're insulin sensitive, it means that your body only needs a small amount of insulin to move glucose into your cells. It means glucose is being used efficiently for energy instead of being stored as fat. Now, insulin resistance. This is the one that we're not a fan of. This is not good. It's when your body becomes less sensitive to insulin and your cells stop responding effectively. So as a result, your pancreas pumps out more and more insulin, leading to chronically elevated insulin levels. Now, high insulin actually locks fat away in storage and blocks lipolysis. Lipolysis is fat breakdown. Lipogenesis is fat storage. So think of insulin, and you're probably going to roll your eyes here because you've likely heard this analogy, but for those of you who haven't, think of insulin as a key in your cells as locked doors that needs glucose. Now, when you are sensitive, the key fits perfectly in the lock. The door opens smoothly to let glucose in. Now, when you are insulin resistant, the key is rusty. It takes more effort to open the door. You got to wiggle it. Sometimes it barely opens. You also have glucose kind of like piling up in the bloodstream, so on the other side of the door, and your body then compensates by continuing to produce more insulin because it's not going through the feedback loop that it's seeking. Now, over time, this system becomes less efficient and glucose is more likely to be stored as visceral fat instead of being burned as energy. So there are 4 markers that we need to assess in uncovering whether or not we are partitioning nutrients effectively. So fasting glucose, this measures your blood sugar after not eating for at least 8 hours. This is one that are on most panels that you're going to get done, and this is typically why we need you to be fasted. So yes, that includes anything with caloric value. So beverages, even small, like, I don't know, vitamin gummies, like whatever. We want this normal range to be within 70, we'll say, to 100 to 99. But it's typically at the point where I see someone who's like 95, 100, and it is also relative to the state that they're in. So in the case that someone is in the off season, they're a little bit higher body fat, they're eating more food, maybe we do let this escalate up from 85 to 95. When someone's in a contest prep, if that value is still on the higher side or trending up, well, this could be indicative that they're not partitioning nutrients in the most effective way, and that potentially the overall allostatic load, the stress associated with, the state they're in, that fat loss phase, it's not allowing them to be very effective in managing glucose levels. So it does need to be weighted conscious to the phase that someone's in and their body composition. But essentially, fasting glucose just means there is an elevation in circulating glucose that indicates a poor blood sugar regulation. Could be tied, we see this in clinical setting, is tied to prediabetes or stress-related glucose spikes. Second lab marker, fasting insulin. Now, this measures how much insulin your body is producing while you're fasted. Ideally, we want this under 10. Optimally, I would say closer to 5, 6, 7. But what it means is that elevated insulin would suggest insulin resistance, meaning your cells aren't responding to insulin properly, so your body keeps producing more. Now, it's important to understand that, like, my last panel, I went and had a protein shake before, and I was very much of the impression, I'm like, hey, like, I know this is going to offset these levels because I'm not fasting. My insulin is going to be elevated. My glucose is going to be elevated. And what do you know? They were. So whenever you go to get labs done, if you were getting these checked, it's really important that you're very clear on if you are fasted and that you are documenting that accordingly, or at least reporting it to the lab administration that, hey, I am or I'm not fasted. A1C. Now, this is going to give you a 3-month average of blood sugar levels. And we want this range between 4.5, 4.8, upper end. You're going to see people say 4.7, 4.8. I will say that, like, for physique enhancement, optimization, it really does depend on the context of the phase in which we're in. But also, it's like if I start to see someone's levels beginning to trend up, even if we're like 5.1, 5.3, 5.5, and like I know we still have a bit of a leg ahead, that food is going to be high, body fat's going to be high, that is a point in which I may intervene and be like, hey, I think we need to take some kind of approach to bring these levels down or help you modulate glucose better. Sure, like there are people that like they get all like up in arms. They're like, why would you have metformin? They're not pre-diabetic. And it's like, okay, well, if someone's like trending that way and there's no indication that something's going to change or we're going to undo some of, this consequence, it's like, it might be better to be a little more prophylactic. So high levels do suggest long-term glucose dysregulation and potentially prediabetes. Now, The fourth marker is HOMA-IR, so homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance. All this is a calculation value using fasting glucose, fasting insulin. We want you at less than a 2. So similar to the A1C, we're looking at the trend. And like, that's really what I want to gather is like, is fasting insulin and fasting glucose, is this HOMA-IR? Is it elevated because that person drove back from LA all the way to San Jose and they didn't sleep much and they were on a plane before that and they were traveling the whole month prior to, so they're very dysregulated. They're going from East Coast to Pacific time and they're very discombobulated, for lack of any other better term. Really, we just need to assess, is that HOMA-IR, is that accurate or is it artificially inflated? But a high HOMA-IR indicates insulin resistance, which is a major roadblock for fat loss. Now, contributing factors, being sedentary, low muscle mass, excess calories, elevated levels of refined carbs and sugars, chronic stress, elevated cortisol, which does raise blood sugar, poor sleep, which is going to disrupt insulin signaling. Now, there are non-pharmacological methods we can use to approach this, and there are pharmacological ones. Non-pharmacological is going to be strength training, building muscle, increasing glucose uptake, focusing heavily on the diet side and micronutrient profiles, including proteins and fats into these carb-dense meals and fiber to stabilize blood sugar, walks after meals to reduce post-meal glucose spikes, and obviously some stability in your circadian rhythm cycle, prioritizing sleep and managing stress. For severe cases, yes, we could consider something like a GLP-1. I wouldn't consider metformin as like, I don't know, a turning point. Like when you have someone who's getting on a statin or a blood pressure medication, an ARB or ACE, it's like, okay, well, they probably aren't able to correct it with lifestyle modifications. And in this case, I would say metformin could be something that you use prophylactically. You can come on and off. And I would say, especially in the case of the physique athlete or someone who's trying to get the most out of what they're doing, metformin could be a benefit here. Now, thyroid function. This is your body's thermostat for your metabolism. It controls how fast and slow your body burns energy. If thyroid function is off, even a calorie deficit is going to be a bitch to dig through, and it might not produce the same results that you're expecting. And this is especially important if we're talking about at the beginning of contest prep or pre-contest prep or pre-fat loss phase. It is something I would say, like, I always want to get checked, really all these markers, I want to get checked prior to starting contest prep or a significant fat loss phase, because I want to see, like, what is the probability that this goes off without a hitch? Like, what is the likelihood we can have a successful fat loss phase ahead of us? And for thyroid markers, and if you want the full deep dive in depth, I would look at the last episode that I posted. It should be like 2 weeks ago, maybe more than that, but I go like full unpacking on these hormones and their ranges. But we've got TSH, which I want this typically close to a 1.5 if we're starting a fat loss phase. If it is over that, I mean, like, I am going to lean more towards like, hey, what is the rationale or practicality of using exogenous thyroid hormone? Like, if we don't have any more runway to pull out from simply correcting using non-pharmacological interventions, perhaps we need to revisit some kind of HRT for thyroid function. But high TSH, that can elevate, that can indicate hypothyroidism. 2 to 2.5. I'm not freaking out, but I am like, hey, why is this happening? We need to look a little deeper into it. 3, 4.0, that's when I'm going to be looking at antibodies. That's when I'm like, what's going on? Like, is there potential autoimmunity related to thyroid that's occurring? Now, free T3, free T4 ranges, they do vary on lab panels, so understand this, but anywhere from a 3 to a 4.5, I'm happy with that. It is relative to TSH for me. Like, I am comparing this relative to prior readings too, which is why I like to get labs at specific intervals throughout the year. But free T3 is the active hormone driving metabolism, and low levels do indicate that there is slower metabolic function. Now, T4, in itself, it's not going to do much on its own, but it is going to convert into free T3. So The range we want to see here between 1 and 2, that would be ideal. But really a fourth value we want to look at is reverse T3, because this indicates your body elevated levels. Reverse T3 indicates that your body's slowing down metabolically as a stress response. So what's happening with the elevated reverse T3, which I would say like in a contest prep, you might even see values up to 15, maybe up to 20, but like we really need to assess like where in the process is this happening. Is this in the first month? Is this 6 weeks in? Is this at the very tail end? Not a big fan of getting the tail end reads because we know they're going to be shitty, but in the case that it's very early on in prep, this could cause us to pause and at least decide like, hey, is it very wise at this point to continue if we're already struggling this much? But tangentially, let me get back to mechanism, what reverse T3 actually is for those of you who didn't watch the thyroid podcast. Reverse T3 is when T4 is not being converted into T3, and instead it's being converted into reverse T3. It's a compensatory mechanism that the body is trying to preserve resources through. So if we do see that elevation, and I would say like 15 to 25, that's a range that I'm like, okay, why is this happening? And how much of the fat loss phase do we actually have left? What have we been doing up until this point? But really like causes behind thyroid dysfunction as a whole: chronic caloric restriction, so perma-dieting, overtraining, nutrient deficiencies, so specific to iodine, selenium, zinc, inflammation, and chronic illness, being on hefty doses of antibiotics, antifungals, corticosteroids, stress elevating cortisol, which impairs the conversion of T4 to T3. Now, ways that we address these nutrient deficiencies: we avoid the extreme diets. We avoid over exercising. This is one of the reasons that like the approach that I take, it is a very principles based approach to contest prep. It's like, if we don't have to do these extremes, we shouldn't do them. Like if they're necessary and they're acute and they're because of poor planning, okay, now we should learn from that and not make the same mistake again. But we should avoid these extreme bouts of low energy availability when we can. And yes, like someone would be like, well, isn't contest prep all of that? It is. But there are better ways to go about it. We don't have to do it with the whole like hour or 2 hours of cardio a day, 900 calories. Someone commented that today. I put up a post about like extreme calorie diets or something like that. And she's like, yeah, like, some of us just have to dig a little bit deeper. I was at 900 calories, an hour and a half cardio, 7 days a week. I'm like, 900 is so little. Like that's not what I meant by saying like you might just have to commit to it. But anyways, I digress. Supporting stress management, proper recovery, thyroid medication if required, or in the case it's indicated, like in the sense where in contest prep, when we know that thyroid function is going to downregulate, this might be something to consider at that point if we're committed to seeing out the prep and we don't have a lot of options outside of that. Cortisol, this is your body's stress hormone, and it is great for short-term survival, but it does wreak havoc if chronically elevated. So if we dig a little bit deeper into cortisol and how it operates throughout the body, to really understand the impact on fat loss and overall health, we need to cover these 3 areas: the feedback loop, the concept of allostatic load, and the different types of stressors that trigger it. Now, when you look, you have a stressful situation, a stressor, a trigger in any form or fashion. This can be mental, physical, emotional. It activates the hypothalamus in the brain. The hypothalamus releases CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, with the signal to the pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. Now, the ACTH travels through the blood to the adrenal glands. These are the glands, they sit on top of your kidneys. They prompt them to release cortisol into the bloodstream. Now, cortisol does its job. It mobilizes energy by raising blood sugar, breaking down muscle, so proteolysis, and suppressing non-essential systems like digestion, reproduction. So this is what we're seeing when we see anovulation, amenorrhea. This ensures you have the energy to deal with said stressors. So your body, understand that like your body is so smart, and it is always looking to work to achieve and maintain homeostasis. There's a stressful situation, there's a stress response, it's always looking to correct. And it's not a bad thing. And when cortisol levels rise to an appropriate level, the brain receives this feedback signal to reduce those 2 first hormones, CRH and ACTH production. This lowers cortisol output and helps the body return to that homeostasis. Now, the problem arises when stressors are constant or overwhelming. Instead of cortisol levels rising briefly and then coming back down, the feedback loop gets disrupted. Your body stays in this constant state of stress, keeping cortisol levels elevated for an extended period of time. And over time, the brain becomes desensitized to the feedback signal and the HPA axis becomes dysregulated. Now, this can lead to two scenarios. Chronically elevated cortisol, the system keeps pumping out cortisol, leading to belly fat storage, so visceral fat gain, sleep disruption, and muscle breakdown. So think about when you're experiencing like that heightened like focus and like it's quite productive in the morning, like that is cortisol giving you the energy to go about your day. Now, when we're seeing those elevations even at night, despite poor sleep, that could indicate that cortisol cycle, that undulation of cortisol is dysregulated or dysfunctional. Now, cortisol burnout, adrenal fatigue-like state, which is a concept that is heavily challenged in the medical community. But for this application, let's just explore it. The system becomes exhausted and cortisol levels drop too low, leaving you feeling fatigued, burned out, and unable to handle stress. Now, this is something that I would say is a little more advanced and not necessarily what I see is incurred even through contest prep. So to give context here, like there are individuals I'm sure who've gone through contest prep who the contest prep itself pushed them over the edge and led them to cortisol burnout or something of that or the other, where they needed severe intervention to re-regulate. But this isn't something I vastly see. I do see most people able to manage the stress of contest prep and come out of it without experiencing cortisol burnout. Because as I was like putting this together, I was like, I think a lot of people are going to assume, well, prep is so extreme. Like you talk so much shit on prep and so hard. It's like, why would anyone do it if it leads to this and it doesn't lead to this? Just to be clear. Now, to understand how this feedback loop gets overwhelmed, we have to talk about and we have to understand allostatic load. Now, allostatic load refers to cumulative wear and tear on your body caused by repeated and chronic stress over time. It is your body's attempt to adapt to stress. And when the load becomes too heavy, your system starts to break down. So think of it like your body is a bridge and it's built to handle a certain amount of traffic being stress. If the traffic becomes constant, like heavy trucks crossing at all hours, the bridge starts to crack. This is allostatic load. It's your body's stress burden exceeding its capacity to adapt. Now, stress is not just limited to arguments, to financial stress, to physical stress. It's the compounding factors of all of these stresses at all times and the degree in which they weigh on you, whether you disassociate or whether you acknowledge them. There are always weights associated with these stressors for probably everyone watching this. So when we look at physical stress, this can be overtraining, injury, illness, chronic pain, or even lack of sleep. So this can not only just be the input of actively doing something, but not doing enough of the right things to decrease that physical stress. Now, the stressors increase the body's demand for recovery and resources like nutrients and sleep. Now, nutrients and sleep, like food, sleep, those are the two levers that your body's going to always actively seek to offset the physical stressors as well as the emotional and mental stressors, not to mention the metabolic stressors. So when we go into mental and emotional stressors, look at like work pressures, financial concerns, relationship conflict, or grief. And you got to think, like, even at a baseline, there are probably some of you who, like, in your environments, whether that be work, home, whatever it is, you might just be sitting in an elevated state of anxiety, tension, stress. And this is one of the reasons that I think, like, if you're in that environment, you should actively try to diffuse that stress if you can. And if you're not able to diffuse it, I would actively try to change that environment. These stressors trigger the same cortisol release as physical stress, even though there's no immediate physical threat. So this is what we talk about when someone just like lives in fight or flight mode, is like they're never able to settle back down and trust, like physiologically feel safe in their environment. And this can be very real and manifest physically. Now we look at metabolic stress, chronic caloric restrictions, nutrient deficiencies, so shitty diets, blood sugar dysregulation. These things keep cortisol elevated as your body interprets it as a threat. Now, when we look past this, environmental stressors, probably confusing. You're like, what work, relationship, those are environments. But I'm talking like quite literally like toxins, pollution, noise, endocrine disruptors like microplastics, these stressors place additional strain on your body, requiring energy and resources to detoxify. So this is where being very clear about like what is the stressor, what is the catalyst for causing said feeling. And I think you need to be really clear with what that feeling is or what that stress manifests as for you. Now, when stressors keep piling up, cortisol stays elevated. Here's what happens. You see an increase in blood sugar because cortisol raises blood glucose to provide quick energy. And if you're not burning it, this triggers insulin release, leading to a propensity to insulin resistance and visceral fat storage. Now, it's the second point, fat redistribution. Cortisol promotes visceral fat storage because visceral fat cells are more sensitive to cortisol. This fat is fat that surrounds your organs and contributes to inflammation. Time and time again, this is something that I see very often in the fitness world within the space of competing. People will finish a show, they'll start to regain body fat, and they'll be like, yo, I've never stored body fat at my stomach, but those first 5 pounds, like that's where it sticks. It just comes on differently and it's very, very offensive. And like when you look at the catalyst for that, I mean, it's like you're coming out of a state where energy was low. You probably weren't insulin resistant, but cortisol was likely very elevated for a sustained period of time. It's not as atypical or unexpected as you might think. It's actually pretty expected given the scenario. Now, you can actually see an increase in muscle breakdown. You'll see that there is elevated levels of cortisol that will then target muscle tissue to release amino acids for energy. Less muscle means a slower metabolism, making fat loss harder. Now, really big thing to catch on to here, high cortisol disrupts melatonin production, making it harder to fall asleep, stay asleep. Poor sleep further raises cortisol levels as that is a stressor and worsens insulin resistance. So you can see that chronic stress suppresses reproductive hormones like progesterone, like testosterone, leading to further fat gain and energy dysregulation. And the good news is that you can reduce allostatic load and reset this cortisol feedback loop, but it's going to come down to the basics. So prioritizing sleep, managing mental and emotional stress, balancing exercising, so not overtraining, but mixing high amounts of weight training alongside cardio that complements the state that you're in and your recovery capacity and availability. So eating to support blood sugar stability, this is just going to come down to eating micronutrient dense foods, eating whole foods, meals that are macronutriently composed in a way that support the offset of that elevated blood sugar spike post-consumption. Fiber is going to be huge here. That's also going to aid in gut regulation and support your microbiome, which is going to have direct effects on thyroid function, which, as you can see, it's like this is all interweaving related to your ability to manage this cortisol response. And it's not to say that any of these acute bouts of dysregulation are permanent, but you do need to make an active effort and be very intentional with the behaviors and your food selection as well as your program design if these things are becoming problematic and in turn impeding your fat loss. So cortisol lab testing, just getting a blood cortisol test. This is going to measure cortisol at a single point in time, typically in the morning when levels should be highest. Now, the reference range we want is up to 20, 22. If it's elevated or low, it can indicate an imbalance. But blood testing only provides a snapshot and doesn't show patterns throughout the day. So you've probably been familiar, if you yourself or you know someone who has had issues with managing cortisol levels, that there are salivary and urine cortisol tests that are called Dutch tests. These measure cortisol throughout the day, multiple time points, and also looks at cortisol metabolites. It provides a full picture of your cortisol curve, meaning morning peak, afternoon decline, and nighttime drop off. Now, a Dutch test is indicated when symptoms of cortisol imbalance are present, but blood testing is inconclusive. So these symptoms would be fatigue that doesn't improve with rest, difficulty sleeping despite feeling exhausted, stubborn belly fat despite exercise and diet, so even like fat redistribution based on what you were previously used to, hefty cravings for salty and sugary foods. But It's also helpful even when athletes are not symptomatic, or individuals who are not symptomatic who are experiencing chronic stress, to evaluate HPA, so hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis function. And we can pull other labs to make this comparison and really build a comprehensive picture as to what could be driving this dysregulation. Here's the reality. I'm not going to recommend a Dutch test for most people unless there's an indication. So for routine screening in someone without symptoms of cortisol imbalance, even someone who is under a high degree of stress, it might be more insightful, and sure, we can gather some information, but I don't think that's necessarily worth the cost because it can be very expensive. And specifically in the state where someone is in contest prep, it's like we could get this done, but we also know that reasonably we can assume there is some degree of cortisol dysregulation. So if we're not already, we should be putting those non-pharmacological strategies in place to ensure that we're exploiting every opportunity to regain regulation related to that stress response. Now, personally, I like to get estradiol tested. Sure, you can look at all forms of estrogen, but specifically estradiol, I like to look at that between days 19 and 21. So really like 5 to 7 days prior to someone getting the first day of their bleed. And I like to look at this relative to the progesterone ratio. Estrogen plays a key role in determining where body fat is stored. Now, when estrogen levels are too high or too low or otherwise imbalanced, it can lead to fat redistribution as well as a slew of other systemic effects. Now, when we're talking about its role in fat storage, estrogen does help regulate fat storage specifically to subcutaneous areas like the hips, thighs, particularly in women. Now, this is part of the female fat distribution pattern. Estrogen also supports insulin sensitivity, meaning it helps the body produce more glucose effectively and reduces the likelihood of storing fat in these visceral areas. Now, when estrogen is low, so think end of a fat loss phase for someone on hormonal birth control, or end of a contest prep, or someone who is chronically stressed to a point that they are experiencing amenorrhea or REDS. When estrogen is low, fat shifts away from the hips and the thighs to the abdomen, increasing that visceral fat gain. Insulin sensitivity decreases, making the body more likely to store fat unfavorably. Low estrogen also contributes to sarcopenia, so muscle loss, reducing metabolism, increasing fat storage. Now, why does this happen? We typically see estrogen levels decline during perimenopause or menopause. So I often see women going through perimenopause at much earlier rates, at much earlier ages, on account of an extensive history of perma-dieting and under-recovering. Now, in men and women, chronic stress, poor diet, extreme caloric deficits, specifically in like relative energy deficiency in sports, that can suppress estrogen levels. Now, what about in the case when estrogen is too high? So there are two types of estrogen dominance. We have absolute, which is where estrogen levels are just simply too high. They're out of range, so over 150. And I would say for the most part, I see people working well in between 75 and 150. Relative dominance is when estrogen levels might be within range technically, but progesterone levels are too low, even though that estrogen is technically normal. Now, relative dominance is when progesterone levels are too low to oppose what we would consider normal estrogen levels. So you could still be between 75 and 150, yet it's the fact that the progesterone is not rising adequately enough to offset them. Now, high estrogen, this can lead to insulin resistance, lipoprotein lipase activity, specifically in abdominal areas, as well as low-grade inflammation. These are all things that are going to tie seemingly to that visceral fat gain and excess water retention. Now, we also see that high estrogen levels increase the production of TBG, so thyroid binding globulin. This is a protein that binds to thyroid hormones, so T4, T3 in the bloodstream, making them unavailable for cellular use. Now, this reduces the amount of active free T3. So this makes it to where your thyroid begins to function at a slower rate. We also see that high estrogen levels can cause water retention, leading to a feeling of bloating and weight gain independent of fat accumulation. Now, when we talk about causes of estrogen dominance, we've got environmental estrogens, so plastics, cosmetics, pesticides, cleaning products that can mimic estrogen, We've got poor liver function. So we need to ask, is this an input or is this a functional issue with another system? So with the hepatic system, is the liver metabolizing and detoxifying excess estrogen the way it's supposed to? Or do we have downregulated hepatic function that can then lead to the accumulation of estrogen? Gut dysbiosis, an imbalanced gut microbiome, can impair estrogen elimination through the GI tract, leading to reabsorption in the bloodstream. This is something that we call enterohepatic circulation. And then we have to consider the role that hormonal birth control can play. I mean, synthetic estrogens in contraceptives, they can exacerbate estrogen dominance by suppressing natural hormone production. The big things that we can do: dietary changes, lifestyle adjustments, and medical interventions as needed. For those dietary changes, making sure that we're eating foods that support estrogen detoxification, such as broccoli, kale, cauliflower. If we're looking at fiber-rich foods to bind to excess estrogen, this needs to be a baseline across all of our systems. We see an improvement in overall health markers, getting in an adequate, a very reasonable amount of fiber per day. So for women, that can be 20 to 35 a day. For men, that can be 35 to 40, depending on body weight. What we need to understand about estradiol is that the values, the serum values that we're getting, have different meanings depending on where you are in your cycle. There are very much times where we want levels to be on the lower end, and there are times where we want them to be on the higher end. Yet without context relative to what your normal cycle looks like, or if you're not having a normal cycle, gaining regularity there, that can be a huge game changer in parsing out and figuring out why some of these imbalances are occurring. Listen, on paper, fat loss is pretty simple. And within my time coaching, I can say that in healthy individuals, it is pretty straightforward. But when glucose management is off, thyroid function's off, stress response is off, estrogen, sex hormones as a whole are off, your body becomes far less efficient at this process. And by addressing these imbalances with the right nutrition, movement, recovery, and testing when needed, you can restore that balance and really get yourself into a position where you can get more out of the efforts you're already putting in.